going to work for it and fight for it and believe in it, then I am absolutely certain that generations from now, we will be able to look back and tell our children that this was the moment when we began to provide care for the sick and good jobs to the jobless. This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. This was the moment when we ended a war and secured our nation.
That was candidate Obama's rousing closing riff in St. Paul, Minnesota on June 3rd, 2008, when he had essentially secured the nomination of the Democratic Party for President of the United States. You'll notice in choosing how to end that speech, he was highlighting the areas of policy focus for a future Obama administration: affordable health care, recovery from financial crisis, hadn't exactly happened yet, addressing climate change, and ending the war in Iraq. In fact, in a provocative piece in New York Magazine, Jonathan Chait argues that with the announcement of last week's unprecedented attempts to cap carbon emissions, the president is putting the final piece of his four-pronged domestic agenda in place. Quoting Chait, the conservative view of President Obama has straddled two difficult-to-reconcile portraits. One indicts him as the Reagan of the left. The other casts him as a hapless mediocrity, a Jimmy Carter redux. There is enormous room left to debate whether Obama's agenda in all these areas qualifies or good or bad, but ineffectual seems as though it should be ruled out at this point. The items that Barack Obama ran on, that he set out a vision for, an agenda that people may or may not like, has arguably been checked off. Despite that, one of the fears that many progressives have is that while President Obama may be doing more on carbon emissions than any other president before him, it still falls far short. Or, put another way,
Chris Hayes.
today, historically speaking, has a chance to be the most important day in the presidency of Barack Obama, and today's huge announcement was why. The most significant effort by any American president ever to curb carbon emissions in this country.
Yes, it's the most significant effort any president has ever taken to combat global warming. Second place, of course, is a 43-way tie for nothing.
Joining me now, political consultant Tara Dowdell, Phillip Agnew, co-founder and executive director of the Dream Defenders, and Josh Barrow, MSNBC contributor, correspondent for The Upshot of the New York Times. Josh, your reaction to so the Chait piece basically says you've got four big main domestic policy areas.
Right.
You've got jobs and recovery, you've got climate, you've got healthcare, and you've got education.
Right.
And the president's done big stuff on all four of them with this new EPA announcement.
Well, I think it's sort of strange to lump these four things together, because what Chait's saying is basically that he has done anything in each of these four areas.
Right.
I think there are two of them where he's done something that's really transformative. I think on healthcare, you've had this big shift with a lot more people covered. We've had cost control, but more importantly, it's setting in motion a set of changes that will happen in health policy that will lead to more people being covered over time. On climate, I think this is a really big deal. People don't pay as much attention to it because it was regulatory and a little complicated, but it will restrict carbon emissions in a way that really matters going forward. On the other two, on education, the idea that the president has had a transformative education agenda, I think, is a bit much. I think he's done some incremental things that are probably better than nothing. And on the economy, it was a recovery from crisis. But going forward, there's no reshaping of the American economy.
That's to me what I always come back to is I think about that election in 2008. And I think if you rerun the tape, that election really was about two things. It was about Iraq and healthcare.
Right.
It really was. Like, it was about ending the Iraq war, and healthcare was and we ended the Iraq war, and healthcare reform happened.
Right.
As someone thinking about organizing this sort of next generation of political activists, like, what do you see as the legacy, particularly around things like healthcare?
I mean, I think it's important. I agree with the article. He's not terrible, but he's not great either. I think the presidency of Obama has really highlighted how important the states are. All politics truly are local. If you're in Florida, no matter what the president or the federal government does on health care, you've got a governor that still said no to Medicaid expansion. No matter what they do on education, you've still got a school system that incarcerates more kids than anybody. No matter what they say about the environment, you've still got a state that's listed by the federal government as one of the biggest threats to the environment in the coming future. No matter what he says about the economy, black people in the state of Florida are still among the most unemployed in the country. And so while he's not the worst president ever, while he has kept a lot of promises, if you look at Florida and on the state level,
that's more of an argument, though. That's more of an argument, Tara, about the constraints of how of the presidency, right? And about the backlash politics that came to his first 2 years in office.
Exactly. I think that the president, considering everything is about context, and the context that he came in with was enormous. He had enormous problems to deal with. And I think given that, the president has done a very good job. But I think you make a good point. All politics is local, which is why people should be voting in their local elections. But I want to add something. I think the president underestimated two things. I think he underestimated the viciousness of the Republican Party in blocking his agenda. And I think he underestimated the Democratic Party, because we are all, this is a hard party to govern. We are all very different.
Well, that backlash, I want to connect what happened in the states to what he did in the first 2 years, because the two are connected. We'll talk about it when we get back. Back still with me, Tara Dowdell, Phillip Agnew, and Josh Barrow. And you were making the point about the sort of internal obstacles in the Democratic coalition in terms of navigating all this stuff, particularly on these domestic policy issues.
Absolutely. People do not give enough time to this issue. Where were the Democrats when the president was trying to get a lot of this passed? We weren't out on the streets protesting the way that you see Moral Mondays now. We needed Moral Mondays before. We needed Moral Mondays in the beginning of his administration. And we didn't have that same kind of fire that the Tea Party did when the president was trying to push many of his agenda.
Yeah, so there was this huge backlash pendulum, and it gets to me, one of the defining legacies of the Obama administration is precisely the difference that you were highlighting about what was happening nationally, what was happening in Florida, and those two things were related, right? Because it was Barack Obama's agenda that pushed this huge surge in older white voters, conservative white voters in that midterm election that elected Rick Scott, gave Florida the government it had.
That allowed for Rick Scott.
Right, that allowed for Rick Scott, and created a government determined to stymie the Obama presidency.
And I think this year kind of underscores the importance of people getting out to the polls. People need to get out there. This is a year, especially in Florida, where folks, if you don't go out there in support of these issues that he's championing, we're going to get another backlash, and we're going to see another resurgence. And so it's really important. I got to wear my executive director hat. Dream Defenders are doing that. And so it's really important this year for that to happen in order to back up all these claims.
And yet you made the point that when you look, I think there's the best way to think about the domestic policy legacy of the president, I'm putting aside war and war on terror for a second, is the sort of short-term, long-term view. And you made this point about what the long-term view is.
I mean, and in 4 years, they'll have the Medicaid expansion in Florida. The 24 states that haven't signed up for it yet
You think in 4 years?
Yeah.
We're holding you to that.
That's, it might be
putting on the board. Josh Barrow.
Yeah, I mean, Rick Scott flirted briefly with taking the Medicaid expansion. His Republican legislature held him in. But basically, there are certain things that there have been resistance to the president that's not durable, either because with the Medicaid expansion, rejecting it is just terrible policy, and you'll come under pressure to implement good policy, but also in the long run, this older white base that the resistance to President Obama activated is a declining share of the electorate over time. I mean, even Texas's politics will look very different than it does now as Texas gets...
I mean, the question is the durability of that backlash, right? To me, the way, I think the most useful way to think about this, and I thought the Chait piece was good about sort of putting the architecture of this forward, is Bill Clinton was very popular when he left office. Bill Clinton had a great run of sort of what the temporary economy of the country looked and felt like during his time, but produced a lot of long-term legislation that was terrible, right? I mean, you had the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the Effective Death Penalty Act, you've got a horrible immigration bill, you got mandatory minimums, all these things that outlasted the boom economy of the Clinton years. Barack Obama, I think, is the reverse, right? I think that actually what the economy has felt like to ordinary working people during Barack Obama's time has been rough. I mean, it has not been a walk in the park. It's recovered, but it's been rough. But the things that he's produced that will outlast his presidency, particularly the Affordable Care Act, are going to be looked back on years from now as like, that was a good piece of legislation.
I think that's likely, but I think it's also likely we'll see a lot of missed opportunities on the economy. The president sort of focused on recovery from this acute crisis, and we did better at that than most other rich countries did. But there was, on inequality, even on things like intellectual property or infrastructure, things that...
Or even the folks that you're working with down in Florida, where it's like, do things to the kids that you're organizing in Florida look that different under Barack Obama than they did under George W. Bush, than they did under Bill Clinton?
No, they don't. But a lot of the things he's come out and said, Eric Holder has come out and said about school discipline, about boys and men of color, which has been problematic. You left out a whole population of people that needed the help. I think what he has been able to do is open the door for some real organizing on the ground.
Organizing around these things like school to prison pipeline, around like sort of rolling back the war on drugs.
Absolutely. So his words are going to lead to actions by us. We've got to follow it up by action. There are mandates right now without funding, but it's still a lot of work to be done.
And one of the secrets is that a lot of the issues that are impediments to African-American employment are at the local level.
Right.
And so a lot of times the onus is put on the president for things. All they can do is give funding to the states, to the local governments. It is up to those states to determine what happens. And so, again, to your point, that's why we need people on the ground making sure that that accountability occurs.
Or you can imagine a situation in which we had 4% unemployment and everything would be better and I think we'd all be happier, and then it just gets wiped away by a crash, which is what happened to Bill Clinton, right? Yeah. That doesn't stay in the history books. That's not something people can sort of come to depend on 20, 30, 40 years out. And that's why I think the Affordable Care particularly is so meaningful in this presidency. Political consultant Tara Dowdell, Phillip Agnew from Dream Defenders up in New York City, live in the flesh, and MSNBC contributor Josh Barrow. Thank you all.
Thank you.
That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening.